In 1914, at the beginning of the First World War, the German mark stood at about 4.2 to the US dollar. 9 years later, it stood at more than 4 trillion to buy a single dollar. That is not an error, and it's not an exaggeration. It literally went from 4.2 to 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. It's one of the most astonishing economic collapses and catastrophes in modern history, and it happened to one of the most advanced nations on earth, Germany. And it's behind every book that I write. My name is Jason Collings, and I write the Alaric von Trelow mysteries that are set in Weimar, Germany, the period in German history between the end of the First World War and the rise of Nazism in 1933. And because this economic pressure, this economic collapse was so fundamental, it meant that money stopped making sense. And so let me tell you how it happened and what it did, because it's fundamental to the whole history of the period. It began, like so much of the decade, with the war. Germany chose to pay for the First World War, not mainly through taxes, but by borrowing, gambling everything on winning and making the losers pay. This had worked for them previously. It had worked for them during the Franco-Prussian War, and they'd benefited enormously in the years after 1871 as a result. So this seemed like a good bet, but Germany lost. And so not only did they not get the money they had expected, the same happened in reverse, that after the Treaty of Versailles, they had to pay the victors, the British, the Americans, the French, the Belgians. And the debts that they had borrowed against also came due, so they were being hit twice. A government facing those kind of bills couldn't possibly meet them within the bounds of their normal payment structures. And so economic pressure started to build. And these weren't bills that they could ignore. They had to pay them, particularly the reparations debts that were incurred by the Allies. Otherwise, there was every chance that these still heavily armed enemies would just invade their nation. And so, to avoid this, the Germans decided to print money. Now, they didn't just print it in small quantities, they started to print it in vast quantities. Now, for a few years, the decline was steady rather than catastrophic. Money became worth less. This impacted particularly those who were on fixed incomes, pensioners, those on fixed salaries, those earning fixed returns from investments. But by 1923, it had become a nightmare. When Germany fell behind on reparations, the French and the Belgians decided that they would use that ultimate sanction. They invaded. They marched into the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany. And they started to take payment by force. Now, the German government decided that they would try and resist. They couldn't do so militarily. They'd been essentially disarmed. But they called for a general strike. This had one benefit, that the French and the Belgians weren't taking out what they thought. In fact, they were taking out less than a tenth of what they'd been taking as a result of the reparations payments before they invaded the Ruhr. Yet this passive resistance, this general strike, meant that the workers weren't getting paid by the factories, and therefore they needed to be supported some other way. And so the government printed more money, oceans of it, for the millions of idle workers who were just sitting there not doing anything. And that was the point where this already creaking edifice of fiscal stability suddenly gave way. Prices didn't rise, they detonated. And this is where you have to start thinking less about the numbers and more about the people. Prices doubled, then they doubled again. Sometimes they would double in a day. Workers were being paid daily, then they were being paid twice a day, and you would get paid at lunch and you would immediately run out and run to the store, any store, and buy whatever they had. You might start off trying to get food, but pretty soon it didn't matter. Buy a pair of shoes, buy a pair of trousers, even if they didn't fit, because at least it was a tangible object that had a theoretical value, unlike the money, which by the end of the day would be worth nothing. A cup of coffee could cost more when you finished it than when you started it. So you had to pay for it in advance, because otherwise it could cost twice as much as it did when you walked into the cafe. People would carry their wages in suitcases, wheelbarrows. They would use it to put on their walls because it was cheaper to do that than to buy wallpaper. They started burning it because it was cheaper to use the money in bricks of money than it was to go and buy coal. Banknotes became worth less, literally less, than the paper that they were printed upon. And as said, the people who were on fixed incomes were hit worst of all. If you were poor, you had no money anyway. The devaluation of the money made very little difference to you, whether you took home at the end of your working day 100 marks, 1,000 marks, or 1,000,000 marks, you still got paid for the work you'd done that day. If you were rich, you owned assets, you owned a building, a house, a factory, a mine, land. That changed in value as the inflation changed. You fundamentally still had the asset. But the middle class were absolutely pummeled. They were the ones who were on fixed salaries, fixed incomes, pensions. They had put their money into banks, into investments like pension schemes and insurance policies, and all of these were based upon the value of money. And that money ceased to exist. And essentially, the middle class was wiped out as an economic force. In contrast, the people who didn't do that, who hadn't invested sensibly, who had instead run up debt after debt after debt, found that they could pay those debts off with loose change. The aristocrat or the magnate who had an asset and had mortgaged it to get more cash and bought more assets, more land, more mines, more factories, could pay off the debt very easily because money had got cheaper, the debt had shrunk. And so what this seemed to imply was that if you were sensible and prudent and did all the things that they had always told you you ought to do if you were a good, sensible citizen, then you were an idiot. And if you were a chancer, a risk taker, somebody fundamentally untrustworthy who's trying to screw the bank out of the money that they've loaned you, well, good for you. That makes sense. The world is rewarding you. And so the inflation did something quite poisonous. It punished the prudent and it rewarded those who were profligate. It turned the world of money upside down. It was stopped remarkably almost overnight in late 1923. A new currency, the Rentenmark, strictly limited and notionally backed by the value of the land and industry of the country itself, was brought in. And there was no guarantee it would work. And the bankers who put it in place and the politicians behind them held their breath. But it did. People chose to believe in it. The madness stopped almost as fast as it appeared, but the scar didn't go away. A whole generation had learned that everything solid could turn to vapor in a moment, that the state couldn't protect them, that thrift was for fools. That fear didn't leave Germany. It sat in the national memory, and it shaped what came after in ways that I won't spoil by spelling out. But suffice to say that attitudes and behaviors changed, liberalized enormously, because what's the point of being sensible when it gains you nothing? Take a risk, have some fun, go wild. That happens in the golden years, in the later 20s. And then politically, you also get a realignment. People going, well, being sensible, voting for the moderate candidates, that didn't get us anywhere. That just got us into this ghastly position. It ruined us. So what about these guys over here who are promising wild things? Ordinarily, we wouldn't have looked at them, but being in the middle of the road hasn't helped us. So maybe being over there, whether it's on the left or the right, maybe that is the choice that we should go for. And consequently, from that period onward, you start to see the rise of the extreme parties. And while during the golden era of the 1920s, everything stays politically fairly stable because everybody's making good money by then, and okay, we've kind of forgotten it. As soon as economic stress re-enters the system after the Wall Street crash in October 1929, Germany politically immediately reverts to type that has been established in the early 20s in 1923 and leaps to the extremes. And ultimately, that is one of the key reasons why you get extreme voting patterns in that period, 1930 to 1933, which helps enable the Nazis to come to power. Thanks very much. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you do, please follow, subscribe for more.